Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is King Williams. You may know me as a journalist and a filmmaker based out of Atlanta, Georgia. But I wanted to let you know I actually have a new show where I'm going to be talking about news related to and for Atlanta called The King Williams Show on Loco Plus. And Loco Plus is a new app and a new website that is dedicated to telling the story of Atlanta from Atlanta creatives, Atlanta insiders, Atlanta journalists, and writers. And I am one of those people. And so I'm doing a special break for my show. You will be able to catch it on Friday. Fridays going forward, starting January 8th. But today I want to do a special quick look at the Georgia Senate elections, which for a lot of people, this is your first time checking out Georgia politics. For a lot of people, this is your first time being politically active. And some of us who've been doing it for a long time, this is, for many of us, the most exciting time to be in Georgia politics. And for a lot of us, this is also some of the most stressful times. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the Senate runoffs are about, how we got here, and more importantly, what they mean for everything going forward. So, take a few minutes, just hit, check me out. If you want to talk to me afterwards, you can reach me on Instagram or Twitter at I am King Williams. And again, this is brought to you by Loco Plus. Loco Plus is a great new startup out of Atlanta, and I am one of the people who are going to be telling a lot of the news and stories coming out of Atlanta. So, right now it is 9:33 p.m. On Tuesday, January 5th, 2021. Right now, the polls are going back and forth. Some polls have currently Raphael Warnock and David Perdue leading their races, but then now has switched again to Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue leading their races. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And so one of the things right now we got to just be mindful of is that this is going to change for a minute. Um, Kind of like expected. Some of the more rural, more red counties in Georgia, some of the more red areas have went for Purdue and Loeffler. But before we get into that, I want you guys to understand how we got here. Georgia is very different from some states. So Georgia historically has been a state which has been overrepresented by white Southern conservatism, and more specifically, white Southern segregationism and outright racism at times. And so, to understand the runoff system, you have to understand how we got here. And so, one of the reasons we got here is that Georgia, as a part of Reconstruction, saw a lot of things, like many other places, African Americans voting for the first time. And as a result of the end of Reconstruction, we saw a lot of places that had African Americans throughout the South had their rights to votes taken away, either through the form of poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, or sometimes just outright violence and murder. And Georgia was no different than any other place in the South. One of the aspects that came as a result of Georgia and their electoral system was a new system in the Jim Crow South that essentially became known as the whites only primary. This was a period in which white Southern Democrats um, essentially promoted their own single party system of governance. It was the closest thing we've seen to a dictatorship in the United States within the United States, in the sense that Southern whites, particularly Southern whites who felt as if the Democratic Party was for them, this was a party both of the Confederacy. And what I mean is, these aren't necessarily the party itself is a party that was based by, that came out at the end of, right before the Civil War. And be clear about the Democratic Party was, there was at one point just a Democratic Republican Party. They split. One side became known as the Republican Party, which we kind of know then from like Lincoln and the Radical Republicans and things like that. And the other one became known as the Democratic Party, to keep it short. One of the other things that you should know about the Southern Democratic Party during the Reconstruction era is not only did they keep blacks from voting, they kept an all-white primary system, and this allowed for local laws and state laws to enact and maintain segregation, as well as to put black people back really far. And so in 1917, a new system was developed in order to ensure that, and it was called the county unit system. And the county unit system was essentially the Georgia's version of the Electoral College. And in that Electoral College, what you had was a system in which the more heavily urbanized counties, typically those counties uh, in the historic black areas of the state of Georgia, so your DeKalb County, Fulton County, down in Savannah and Chatham County, even parts of Macon. This essentially made the more urbanized counties with the larger populations, and also by proxy, large African American populations, be relegated to a series of block votes. Those more urbanized areas got 6 votes. The more medium-sized areas got 4 votes, and the more rural got 2 votes within the state legislature. And in doing so, what this did was it allowed for the more rural and much more racist and much more conservative counties to have a outsized level of representation in the state house and the state senate. And so from 1917 really until about 1962, you had this system in which African Americans, the few of them who could overcome every form of poll tax, literacy tax, and other forms of voter suppression who could vote, um, they were few and far between. And so to ensure that this vote came by 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court had to, the U.S. Supreme Court had a ruling, and that ruling stated that Georgia's county unit system was illegal. And in making Georgia's county unit system illegal, what it did was it done away with that system. And so in 1962, you saw that system be done away, and there was an overall consensus of Southern whites that this could be dangerous. And the reason why this was dangerous is in about the 15 years prior, so between really 1947 1962, we see essentially the full arc of the civil rights movement in the United States. The thing that really agitated a lot of Southern whites was that the government, in this case, the U.S. government, was using a lot of times Supreme Court rulings, especially things like Brown versus Board of Education, and in the case of Georgia in 62, um, striking down Georgia's county unit system. A lot of Southern whites saw this as big government and big government infringing upon their rights. And so what happened was there was one particular senator who really is the person who's the architect of this. And the reason why is because Southern whites were really feeling aggrieved by the civil rights movement. They felt as if the government was stepping on their feet and or stepping on their toes and telling them what to do. And it creates this kind of modern ethos of big government, small, localized control, and some of the talking points you see of today's GOP. Now, granted, there was one other thing that was happening during that time period, the civil rights movement, which is a lot of Southern whites were being upset because the Democrats were essentially allowing federal wins to happen for African Americans. And this was something that Southern whites, particularly in the Democratic Party, did not like and did not agree with. And so by the late 1950s, you saw a schism, which was already brewing amongst Southern whites. What happened was a lot of African Americans, when they voted on the presidential level, they would vote for Democratic candidates, even though they would be registered as a Republican. And the reason being is because African Americans then and now vote as a collective unit, as one block. And the reason why they vote as one block is because they are a minority, and because they're a minority, their vote has to count. And so, in doing so, this actually scared a lot of Southern whites because a lot of them were registered as Republicans, which was fine. There weren't that many, but in some cases, they were enough to maybe swing an election, as we see in Atlanta with the election of Mayor Hartsfield. But in some regards, a lot of people were saying that these civil rights would eventually come and voting rights would be reinstated, which they did. And so, as a result of preemptively thinking of that, there was one particular lawmaker who really is the modern architect for this. And this modern architect became what will be known as as the voting runoff system. And so, within that county voter runoff system, it was important to know how we actually got there. That county voter runoff system was essentially a way to preserve two things. One, it was a way to preserve an overrepresentation of white voters, and it also did away with Georgia's plurality system of votes. Because it did away with Georgia's plurality system of votes, that allowed for a runoff situation to happen. This was a way to circumvent a potential of African American voters who voted typically as one block to elect a black candidate to office in the state. And so in 1963, the following year after Georgia's being struck down in the Supreme Court, we have one particular lawmaker, and I'm trying to bring his name up now because I have too many things on my mind tonight. So my apologies. This became, if you want to apologize for me, because I am just drawing a blank right now. So, okay. Yeah, so we had two things that happened. One of which was, hey, so my bad, I had to pause that for a second. So the person I want to make sure I got it right was Denmark Groover. Denmark Groover was a Macon representative who was in office from 1953 to 1957. He is actually the person who helped spearhead Georgia's switch of the Georgia state flag to the Confederate rebel flag. This was done as a retaliation of the Supreme Court's decision desegregating schools in the Brown versus Board of Education system. So in 1956, Denmark Groover was the person who essentially helped bring that to the forefront and get it passed in the legislature. And so as a result of that, he lost his election that re-election year in 1957. And as he was defeated for election, he blamed his losses on what he called a Negro voting bloc of African Americans in Macon, Georgia. Those African Americans voted for his opponent. His opponent um, essentially won election. And so when he came back in 1963, one of his things was retaliation for that. And in doing that retaliation, he came up with a new system. That system would be the runoff system that I proposed, that I told you before, which is that runoff system, again, was a system in which it ended the plurality of the vote, one, and two, it ensured that whoever won election in Georgia had to have at least 50% plus one of the vote. And that reason, again, was to deter Black votes going forward. And he was honestly successful. And the first challenge we had to this was the 1966 governor's race, which in a lot of ways spearheads what we see with the modern day conservatism and some of the outright still racist symbols and dog whistling that we see in Georgia's um, electoral politics. One thing you need to know the 1966 election. This is something that's going on in a broader sense, which is, like I told you guys before, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of Southern whites in general were becoming disaffected with the Democratic Party as they felt like they were becoming too pro integration, too pro Democrat, too pro black. Too pro black. And they felt as if the Democratic Party was abandoning them by using the government to essentially end segregation and end a lot of the Jim Crow laws and policies. And so during that period, you have a lot of whites who are either defecting from the Democratic Party, and you also have this other issue where the Republican Party, particularly since the 1930s, after the beginning of the wins of FDR, had started to abandon Black voters. And so it took about 30 years. But on the national level, Republicans had been making that play to slowly bring in Southern Democrats to have a broader base, something we see historically even now with a lot of talks of the Democratic Party bringing in a lot more rural, a lot more conservative voters. This was also happening in the Republican Party between the 1930s and the 1960s, and it really picked up in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so by 1960, the majority of white voters were still Democratic voters in the South, right? And then the majority of U.S. voters was kind of a little bit between Democrats and Republicans amongst white voters. It was pretty evenly split. And so, as a result of doing that, uh, in the 1960s, we see a lot of Republicans start to pick up a lot of Southern Democrats with the election of one particular man, this man named Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater was a Republican out of Arizona. He is the person that we kind of think of a lot of the modern talking points of conservatism, which is limited government, um, a lot of government, a lot of bringing in the culture wars necessarily of, government shouldn't tell you what to do, this, that, and the third, the notions of private property, individual liberty. His candidacy brings a lot of those together. And that candidacy brings in a lot of Southern voters. He also is a person who did not vote for civil rights on the Civil Rights Act in 1964. He voted against it. That brought him more Southern white voters than expected. And so the 1964 Republican National Convention was one in which it saw the full turn of Black voters away from the GOP. And this is super important. One of the things we kind of bring up, and this is why we're talking about this election in Georgia, is that Black voters had moved away, started already slowly moving away from the GOP already, but many of them were still registered voters, even as late as 1960. Richard Nixon pulled the last large vote of any Republican in 1960, as he pulled in 32% of the Black vote. So the Black vote was pretty 60-40, 50-50 sometimes, depending on who the person was running on the big ticket. And on the local ticket, Black people also voted for Republicans who were typically either what we consider now today closer to white liberals or Black candidates who are able to run in certain vicinities, particularly those in the Northeast and the Midwest. And so, as a result, the Goldwater decision and him winning the RNC's decision, the RNC's presidency, nomination for presidency, I'm sorry, in 1964, brought in a lot of Southern Democrats and a lot of whites who felt disaffected with the Democratic Party. In doing so, it actually expelled a lot of Blacks from the Democratic Party, so much so that people like Jackie Robinson, who had been a lifelong Republican and advocate for the party, and somebody who actually campaigned for Richard Nixon in 1960 to lead a boycott of the Republican National Convention and stage a protest outside of the 1964 convention. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is that also in Georgia in 1964, that is the beginning of the first year where we put into law Georgia's primary system. And then within 2 years, in 1966, this would be tested as you had two candidates running on very similar campaigns. You had Lester Maddox, who was running as the traditional segregationist, loud, bigoted Southern Democrat. And then you had his challenger, who was running as a more practical, pragmatic, still conservative, um, but Goldwater Republican. And that person would be Howard Callaway. And so what happened was you had a instance where Howard Callaway, the more pragmatic but still pro segregation, still anti integration, anti civil rights, but more polished, more respectability, he won the election at 46.5%. He actually had the plurality of the votes. Lester Maddox, who came in second, had 46.2% of the vote, as the third party candidate pulled 7.3%. So none of the candidates pulled the 50%. And so because of this, there was a series of challenges in court on this. And so the Supreme Court upheld Georgia's loophole. And there was a loophole in Georgia that based out of 1842 that allowed for the state legislator to choose the uh, candidate for governor if no one had received the majority of the vote. And in this case, it was comprised of mostly Southern Democrats in the state of Georgia, in the House and the Senate and the upper chambers. And so they picked their candidate, Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox, again, uber racist, arguably one of the most racist leaders in the history of Georgia. You can look him up. He has plenty of clips on YouTube, just capital hard R N word usage there. He was the governor. And so what happened was, as a result, that county unit system that already started being proposed in 63 and came into law in 64, after the 1966 election, it was expanded to all seats in the state of Georgia, which means for both federal, so that includes Senate, Congress, or the presidency, as well as any state level position, every candidate who wins has to receive at least 50.1% of the vote. And because of that, that's how we get here today. And the reason why this is super important is because with that runoff, what that did was it essentially killed off any long term congressional black leadership, particularly in the Senate, as well as it killed off, for the most part, most congressional leadership as well for black leaders, because what happened was because of redistricting as well, it relegated most black people to 2 or 3 districts. So you think about District 5, which is John Lewis, that encompasses where a large portion of our African American population lives at, which is all the city of Atlanta, most of South DeKalb County, and North Clayton. And then it also, in terms of then there's also places like District 6 and District 4. So essentially the black vote would essentially be subjugated to maybe 2 or 3 precincts, but based on population, they maybe should, 2 or 3 congressional districts, or in reality, based on population, probably should have had 4 or 5. And so we see this happen over and over again for the next 25 years. And what happens was African Americans can just not get out the blocks in terms of reaching the Congress, right? And we don't really see until the 1970s, and then picks up more in the 1980s and 1990s, African Americans reaching Congress. And even then, it's still not enough in representation. And it also stops, particularly African Americans in rural Georgia, from achieving high enough positions in local county government. So everything from school board, sheriffs, police commissioners, it kept, especially in the places where African Americans were not the majority, it kept African Americans from succeeding in office, as many of them, when they went to runoffs, they could not reach that level. So much so that in 1990, there was actually another lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court that was challenging this. And there was the U.S. Justice Department in 1990. This is actually under the first Bush administration. Um, Civil rights attorney John Dunn looked into more than 20 Georgia counties that had a series of places where, what I said before, where it seems based on population, based on elections, African Americans had won the plurality of the vote, but then these elections would go to runoffs and they would all lose these elections. So he looked at a period of time between 1965 and 1990, looking at runoffs, and every African American candidate had lost, with exception of those in the Metro Atlanta area had lost their vote. And so while he tried to bring that up, just the first Bush era DOJ said there wasn't enough to base this on race, even though there is probable cause that the runoff system disproportionately affected African Americans. And so what we have is, from then on, we have this overrepresentation of white, often conservative political leadership. And so Georgia is one of the few states in U.S. history that has had white political leadership on its upper levels ever since the end of Reconstruction. Georgia is one of the only states, if not the only state, to have white male leadership and white political leadership every year since the end of Reconstruction in the United States, giving essentially a one-party system for white voters, almost up until the modern era. So we're talking from 1872 to 1872 to 2002, the Georgia Democratic Party, which again I said was it started out as a Southern segregation. It was a lot of Southern segregations within the party, but again, these are not the same Democrats of today. They switched over to Republicans in the 1960s, so don't at me. Read your books. It's important to know that that political leadership is still intact today. So Georgia has never had a governor, a lieutenant governor, or a secretary of state, as well as a U.S. senator who is not both white, conservative, and more importantly, uh, not representative of the population. Georgia's white population is about 60%. Our people of color population is around 40%. And so our political leadership should be reflective of that. And so this election has been essentially 50 years overdue. We should have started having these type of runoffs and these contested elections, and we should have had more representation back in the 60s and the 70s. But because of a lot of reasons, we've had that held on to where it is now. And so if it wasn't for Stacey Abrams in the 2010s being motivated by the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision by Chief Justice John Roberts, doing away with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which did away for pre-clearance for places like Georgia and other southern states, which had historic eras of voter suppression and voter intimidation. That essentially allowed for this new version of voter suppression and intimidation to start. And so, coincidentally enough, Brian Kemp and the Republican Party, and now his current, his current predecessor, Brad Raffensperger, all of the voter suppression and voter intimidation tactics that begun immediately after the 2013 decision inadvertently has motivated a new base of Black voters, Democratic voters, and those people new to the state of Georgia. And so, in a lot of ways, this election is not only just an indictment of that old system of doing things, it's also an indictment of the Supreme Court's decision to uphold to do away with protections for the Voting Rights Act. And it's also an indictment on the Bush era DOJ to not step in when we had evidence back in 1990 that Georgia was doing things related to voting that were questionable. It also is an indictment on the current electoral policies and electoral processes of many state legislators, which have over-indexed with white male conservatism, and that white male conservatism has not benefited or been done for the advancement of Georgia or for its African American population. And so what we're seeing now is not only a surge of people who are both anti-Trump, anti-Kemp, anti-Loeffler, anti-Warnock even, right? So what we're seeing is essentially a smashing of two things, like two realities: the old white Southern guard of things and this newer model, which is more purple. It's a little bit conservative, a little bit liberal, but it's definitely not built in it's coming out of the old Southern model. And so I would expect this election, no matter how it goes, I don't know, but I would expect this election to be essentially the canary in the coal mine to not only Georgia, but the rest of the South. As the rest of the South is experiencing an uptick in people moving back to the South, this includes Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, a number of people who move into the South for a variety of reasons, as well as a number of African Americans who've been in the South since the end of the Civil War, who are now becoming more motivated, or their great grandchildren and grandchildren are becoming more motivated to become involved in electoral policies. And this also includes a new demographic of people as well, which are Asian and Latino voters, as well as our Arab communities who are now motivated as a result either for Trump or against Trump over the last couple of years. So you're going to see a lot of people banging on electoral politics, and you're going to see a lot more challenges going forward with this notion of runoffs and a lot of Jim Crow era systems to preserve white hegemony. And so the irony is the thing that had been done to preserve white votes may be the thing to undo it with this election. So we'll see. Again, it's 9:57. I've been talking for 24 minutes. I don't know how this is going to go, y'all. But again, this is King Williams. I hope you all check this out. Make sure you all go to Go Local Plus. So go LOCO plus PLUS.com. So again, that's where I'm at. You can reach me out on social media at I am King Williams on Instagram and Twitter. So at I am King Williams on Instagram and Twitter, and Go Local Plus, GOLOCOPLUS.com.